So welcome everyone. Welcome to Spice World. How's everyone doing this morning? More energy than I expected. Wow. All right, awesome. Hopefully that bacon was helping. All right. So, who's ready to be a knight for their Active Directory? Yes, yes. Okay, awesome. All right, so let's get some greetings and salutations out of the way first. My name is Christopher Cly. I am a senior cybersecurity engineer for a managed service provider out of Chicago, Illinois. Been in IT about 20 years. Got a couple of certifications behind me, but that's kind of boring. Beyond that, I also work in diversity and inclusion as being an advocate, speak for it, and also participate and encourage other companies to do so. The other thing I do is I used to be a former rugby player, and I also like to throw glitter, but I don't want to tick off the staff here, so I'm going to try not to throw glitter. Oh, yeah, exactly. All right, so first things first this morning, we're going to get through some best practices to harden your Active Directory. This is going to work on improving the posture of it. A lot of it is some of the basics. Some of you may look at this and go, seriously, you're telling me about this? I've heard about this a long time ago, but we sometimes forget about it. When we work in IT, we get through the regular grind. We start forgetting some of the stuff that maybe we did when we started in IT, and so it's very easy for us to lose sight of it, and then someone gets an advantage on us as a result of it. So by a show of hands here, how many people actually know what's going on in their Active Directory environment right now? Okay. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a much better idea, or at least goal, to get to understanding it more. Also at the end of this talk, because I know there's going to be a lot of information I'm going to be throwing at you, at the end I will have a link that will take you to a resource guide, and I also have some cards here that I can hand you as well. It is a 50-page resource guide that details everything that I'm speaking about this morning, tells you how to actually employ it within your environment, and if it was too long for me to type out for you, I give you the direct no-frills link to Microsoft or someone else, so you're not reading someone else's blog about 50 reasons why they hate it before they actually tell you how to do it. So, first things first, document, 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 document. I know that's the bane of our existence sometimes. Writing this stuff down, think Steve Ballmer right now. Back when he was on the stage, back in, if anyone saw that, him screaming developers, 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 developers. Same concept here. We want to be able to help understand how our environment is, not just for ourselves, but anyone else who gets into our network. So let's say you call someone like me into your environment and say, hey, something's gone on, someone got access to our environment. It's going to take me a lot longer if you have no documentation to be able to understand your environment, to know what possibly someone has done. I can go in there, look at your logs and say, hey, yeah, this happened. But a lot of the more intricate things that may allow them to come back in, the best way for us to identify that is through documentation and understanding how your network works completely. So when we're thinking about that, we want to think about, say, your domain configuration. Is your domains configured internal, or are they also external? How is your DNS set up? Is it being managed just internally? Do you have it external? Is it synchronized through that? We want to know how your DHCP is operating. Where is that coming from? Do you possibly have wireless environments that have their own DHCP environment? So your IP attrition, when it comes down to an event, may not actually be accurate. We may know an access point was involved, but we may not know the actual client that was involved. OU design. If you're throwing everything in users and computers, you're killing me, Smalls. Don't do that. One of the easiest things that I have found to be able to identify if someone has gotten into your network is when you do not use those standard OUs, except for the domain controller's OU. Don't mess with that. When you move everything outside the users and computers OU into their own specialized, you're better structuring your environment for your policies down the line. But then when someone goes and puts in a computer, all of a sudden it's going to drop in your default OU. Someone goes and adds a user, it's going to default into that user OU. Well, if you didn't expect a new user show up and you go in AD and all of a sudden you see these new users in that user OU, you know something's going on. So it's a really good honeypot per se, and a very easy, cheap way of starting to identify when someone's gotten into your environment. Group usage, another thing. Security groups, distribution groups, kind of the same thing. Don't be using your security or your distribution groups to be security groups or vice versa. Don't mail enable your security groups. You're just asking for Tammy in accounting to go and add someone to a security list who then has access to all the company's financials. Not really a good idea, you know. And it's not something many people think of, but as a company gets bigger, you start ending up with those kinds of risks. Security assignments. How are you actually assigning security? Hopefully it's by group so that you're not putting individual accounts and then really stressing yourself out when someone leaves or as the company grows. And lastly, group policy. How is that group policy being assigned? Where is that? How is it structured? Are you trying to minimize how it's being deployed? And what do you have it set in? So that way, if I come to you and say, where's your firewall settings at? I don't need to know that's in 20 different GPOs. Hopefully it's in one, maybe 5. Depending on your environment, you can actually get it really well reduced. But I've been in environments before that had over 100 GPOs, and there were 17 modifying their firewall, and they couldn't understand why the firewall wasn't working. So, something to think about. And that kind of leads us into something else everyone's going to hate me for. Structure and process. All right? So structure is going to be how we organize AD, and again, we're kind of laying some ground rules here. So again, you call someone like me in, I'm going to ask you things like, how do you handle your privilege accounts? How do you handle your standard accounts or your service accounts? These are also things you have to start thinking when you start going into compliance, when you start talking HIPAA, when you start talking SOC 2 compliance. You want to be able to explain to an auditor how you set these accounts up. How you deal with your computer objects. How do those get vetted by your IT? Who signs off on certain systems? Permissions and groups, your account management requests. Who is the one who actually signs off? How do you document and make sure that that process has been completed? Is there anyone checking on the back end to make sure, let's say you fired a very high-end user and you don't disable them properly, it becomes a liability for the business. The other thing is when do you actually review all this stuff? When do you review your AD configuration? When do you check on it to make sure that nothing is running out of what you expect? This does take a long time. One of the companies I'm working with now, it has taken them 6 months to accomplish a better structure. For group policy alone, it took 3 weeks just to get a sense of where their group policy was. They had 1,700 settings. That's a lot of settings, and they only actually needed 350 of them. But again, the problem is through our daily course of work, we sit there and go, hey, we need to change the setting on this group. We don't have the time to go back and figure out where it was because they didn't have documentation. And then it starts becoming this big out-of-control beast, and then it gets a job at HP. So, all right. So, hopefully this will help you all out. Backing up domain controllers. What I recommend is if you've ever used NTDS Util, it is actually a very excellent tool to snapshot that database and keep a record of it so that if something happens, you can go back to it. If you need to load that snapshot up to another port, then you can actually compare the attributes from that old snapshot to that new one. So if you're starting to wonder, hey, I think something changed, you can actually start comparing them. If you are doing this through snapshots with your hypervisor, you are going to make me a very sad panda right now. The reason for that is I have dealt with many businesses where people have snapshotted with hypervisors. A Windows update went wrong. Something else went wrong. They reverted from a snapshot a couple hours later. That split the journal in Active Directory. If any of you have ever experienced that, you would want to leave IT. That is how bad it is. When the journal splits, your replication stops, and Windows does not tell you it stops because it thinks everything is fine. So what ends up happening is you might have a computer over here that you recently added, but that domain controller doesn't respect it over there. It doesn't know about it. They're running on 2 different journals now. So password change over here, this computer doesn't recognize it. New user over here, that system doesn't recognize it. You end up having to basically rebuild the entire environment. You have to burn something down and start from whichever journal you think is best. So to avoid that, you want to use the NTDS utility to create snapshots when you can. The other thing you want to do is bare metal backup from Windows Server Backup, or Azure Online Backup is now a supported solution as well. That is the only methodology that Microsoft Support officially supports if you call them and you need assistance in recovering your Active Directory. So if you're using Commvault, if you're using any other type of backup solution, have that backup solution, take a copy of that bare metal backup. And then you don't have to worry about Microsoft saying, wait till you get to a good point before you call us back. because that's something you don't want to deal with. Let's see, was there anything else in there? No. All right. So, with me so far on this? Okay, awesome. All right, so here's some quick tips I can give you that are going to be kind of easy wins for you to start securing your environment before we start getting to more complicated ones. First one is stop using the default administrator account. Seriously, stop using it. It's not good for attrition. If I come into your environment and you can't tell me which admin did an activity, you could fail an audit. So don't do that. Set up separate administrator accounts, preferably tiered, which we'll get to a little bit more in a second. Disable SMB v1. If you know Ned Pyle from the Microsoft group, he is on a mission and a war practically to end SMB version 1. It has been around for 30 years. Your environment is probably still running it. You may still have a NAS somewhere that's still running it because it was the cheapest technology at the time and that's what the vendor wanted to use. Stop using it. Disable it from your environment. That is the quickest way you can get a crypto virus going across your environment. And that is what a lot of those viruses use, is the old school SMB version 1. So get it disabled in your network if at all possible. You want to configure your PDC to update time via NTP. All others need to update through your domain controllers. This is so if, let's say, someone like me got into your network, I cannot modify the time on one of your systems to manipulate your logs so that you don't know what I did in your environment. Control your DNS communication. If you're keeping up with anything about Firefox or Chrome, you'll understand that they're starting to do DNS over HTTPS. Great way of bypassing your proxies in your environment, right? So you want to avoid that by updating with the ADMX files they provide you. You can actually disable that functionality. Firefox particularly, if you start seeing Cloudflare communication and you're not using Cloudflare DNS, block it from your environment. That's a good way of blocking not only their DNS over HTTPS, but also their new VPN service that also goes over HTTPS through Cloudflare. To reduce credential theft, enable restricted admin mode on remote desktop services. It's kind of a not well-known security feature that's available to you. The caveat of that is you have to be a local administrator on the box that you set that up on. So on your servers, absolutely, you should be able to set that no problem if your regular users aren't logging into them. If your regular users aren't logging into their workstations either remotely, then enable it on there too, and then you don't have to worry about the credentials being stolen while you're connecting to remote desktop services. Then we've got IPv6. So how many of you have IPv6 enabled but didn't set anything up on DHCP? So you could have someone tunneling through your network right now with data and you may not know it. So IPv6 you want to manage as well as IPv4. You want to have your DHCP set up. You want to set up your own DNS servers. If your ISP is not IPv6 native, just consider shutting it off until they're IPv6 native. And your security tools are also IPv6 native. A lot of security tools out right now are just IPv4. So as someone who can get into your network, you wouldn't even see my traffic until I hit your firewall. And at that point, I might look like regular web traffic to you. So you don't want to run that risk. Lastly, enable PowerShell logging. It does take a little bit of your resources, but it is definitely valuable when we want to go in and see what's been going on in someone's environment. And it lets you know that if someone's ran something that they shouldn't have. So with that, we start getting into something a little bit more technical. Isolating our networks and segmenting them. Promise this isn't going to seem as complicated as it seems initially. You want to evaluate your network traffic flow. So if you've got documentation of your environment, you're already going to be a head up on this because you'll know what services are running in your environment, where they're coming from, and what your users should be using. Start off by that as a template. As users start complaining to you that something's not working, then you'll know that either your documentation's wrong or Johnny over there is doing something he shouldn't be. You want to isolate your workstation to workstation communication unless necessary. Again, this is also has to do with most of the viruses that are out now. They try and leverage between workstation and workstation, and that's also for lateral movement within your network. So this would prevent someone from getting in on one system and being able to just move from workstation to workstation to gather credentials until they can get the credentials they want. Restricting administrative connections to a privileged subnet. So if your IT team is all working from a single subnet, you don't need those administrative ports to be open to everybody. try and use those systems, try and find ways to remote connect into those systems that you trust for that. And then you're further reducing the footprint that someone has access to and making it just that much harder for them to communicate with your environment. Blocking direct internet access from sensitive systems like Active Directory. Those systems generally do not need internet access. You can use WSUS, or if you have a proxy, you can set your proxy to enable certain domain names, block everything else. Again, it's making it harder for someone who gets into your network to be able to leverage your network to gain more access and start exfiltrating data. So it means even if they get access to a sensitive server, they're now going to have to go backwards to be able to move that data, and it's going to give you more time to be able to identify them and find out what's going on. So, part of this isolation and segmentation will eventually assist you in building sort of like an administrative environment. In an administrative environment, you want to set up different administrator accounts for each tiers. So think your domain controllers as a tier. Think of your other servers as another tier, and then think of your workstations as another tier. Some businesses end up creating more tiers from that. Maybe they have sensitive credit card payment systems, which would be considered a separate tier from their Active Directory. So it all depends on what you have to deal with. The goal is that you want to control access through your GPO user rights and networking segmentation. So in your GPO user rights, you want to limit who can log on locally, who can log on remotely, who can act as a service on the system. And this is going to prevent an account that manages workstations from being able to actually manage your Active Directory. And by doing that, even if someone gets an administrator credential, it's kind of useless to them, right? Because all they can do is mess with the workstation. They won't be able to add something to your Active Directory. They don't have domain admin rights. The only thing they have rights to be is a local admin on those machines. So the other thing is don't allow the enumeration of privilege. So if someone needs a software installed and they require administrative permissions, you want to go ahead and use your workstation admin, never use your domain admin, because then you're leaving your token and your credentials onto that system for someone to harvest later. And this is kind of more of a graphic example of what I just explained. This is what Microsoft had generated, so I'm sorry that yellow is kind of hard to read. But up on the top there, you have tier 0. And if you notice, they say from tier 2, you can't go up to tier 1. But they do say that you could maybe go from tier 1 to tier 2. I wouldn't recommend it. Keep them completely segregated if you can. It will save you when it comes down to someone getting into your network. So if you're able to segment your systems like this, it definitely helps out. It is a little bit of overhead to create those systems at first, but you're going to have a lot less to worry about when someone gets into your environment, that they're very limited in what information that they can gather. So now we're looking at the overall environment. We're going to start kind of getting closer and closer. So now we're on the domain controller level here. So with our domain controllers, you want to turn on the Windows firewall if you haven't, and obviously use the scopes. Similar to the administrative environments, we want to limit who can access what, and stop any services that we're not aware of from being able to communicate with the network. You don't want an old school simple TCP service running so that someone can DOS your environment without you realizing it. You want to remove any non-AD related services. I know this can be hard for smaller businesses, but if all possible, if you can't dedicate a system to AD, consider using like Azure or one of the other solutions out there to have like a cloud-based AD solution that's VPN'd. So that way you can make sure that those systems are only meant for that purpose. You don't want to run anything else on there because you want to keep these systems patched as much as possible. There's very few patches that have ever come out that actually knock down a domain controller, knock on metal. But the important thing here is the more third-party products you start adding to that, the more risk you're going to develop because one of those third-party products may not be compatible with a patch. If you can forge your logs, sometimes this is a nice to have. People don't always have the opportunity to have it or the hard drive space. If you can forge your logs, you actually improve the integrity of them moving forward, because even if someone modifies them, the logs have already been forwarded to a third solution. So the attacker would then have to find that solution before they're able to actually do anything in your network. Patch frequently and consistently, as I mentioned. And again, this whole regularly checking thing. So regularly audit your applications, your system tasks and services. Make sure they're what you expect. If something doesn't seem right, get rid of it as quickly as possible or investigate further to see what may have happened. You would be surprised how many different things I found in someone else's system tasks, including like miners for various cryptocurrency on production application systems, and they had no idea. All they sat there and saw is, I see Command EXE running, but our application's an old school DOS program. So we're not too worried about that. Except you go look in system tasks and all of a sudden you see this little string going to some website and it's just mining for currency. So, all right. Yeah, exactly. Disable web browsing. Please do not browse the web on your domain controllers. It just don't. All right. So now we're going to go a little bit closer. We're going to start thinking about our OUs. So as I mentioned earlier, thinking about not using those computer and user OUs. Make up new ones. Make up ones that work for your environment, that balance the design of your OUs and the structure of your GPOs. So that way you do not have to filter them as much. This will improve performance now minorly more than it used to, but it still does improve performance, so it's still good to do, and your computer's not going through 500 settings if it doesn't have to. You want to use the default OUs as honeypots, with exception to domain controllers. You want to keep your users, groups, and computer objects separate. This is more for simplified administration. It's much easier to tell a junior technician, go to this group to manage, or go to this OU to manage this group. It's a lot harder to say, hey, here's a bucket with every single object that AD possibly has. Good luck. Figure it out. Definitely not fun to do. Separating distribution and security groups. Again, can't stress this enough. You want to keep those separate. You also don't want them to be functioning the same way. Your security group should be separate from distribution. Do not allow someone to modify it otherwise. So now group policies. Remember that person I mentioned? 1,700 group policies. I want to jump off a bridge there. Definitely not something you want to do. You want to try and get this stuff under control. You want to use your WMI filtering and the security filtering sparingly as much as possible. Again, this reduces how much the client workstations have to do in order to get those policies to apply, and then you have less risk moving forward when you start wondering, hey, why did this security control not apply? You want to reduce that as much as possible. The other thing is, if you have user settings and computer settings in separate OUs or GPOs, you may want to consider separating those. You may want to keep your user settings in one GPO and your computer settings in another. If you go ahead and do that, if you right-click a policy, you can actually choose to disable the one you're not using, and that cuts the GPO process for that policy in half. So it's really effective in that sense. You know, you try not to have a GPO with a single user setting with 50 computer settings. That's usually what I'm trying to avoid with this goal. By doing it this way, you're not having that computer evaluate the whole chunk of user settings if you're only changing one thing. So this is kind of an example of what I give different businesses, how I've worked with them, and so far it's been pretty effective. So if this kind of structure works for you, may be beneficial. So I can usually get most companies down to 5 GPOs applying to a single device. Sometimes it might be 6 or 7, depending on their general settings. But you have your default domain policy, then you'll have your type. It could be the server, workstation, or the user policy. Auditing and security policy, which depending on how your settings are, that could actually merge up to the type. But again, the focus is not replicating settings here. So if your auditing settings are consistent across the entire environment, just have one single policy. Role department specific, and then any last minute customizations. Let's say you have your executives are allowed to actually use their USB devices, then you want to enable USB access to them, but maybe deny it to the rest of the business. So from there, going a little bit closer, we're going to look at authentication. The one path you want to be really familiar with in group policy for this would be computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, security options. That is going to be the moneymaker in group policy when it comes to setting most of the security options that will benefit you in your environment. First and the biggest thing, if anyone saw the news earlier this month, Microsoft says you must now sign your LDAP communications and bind the channels effective immediately. By January 2020, they are going to release a Windows patch that will do it if you don't. So if you haven't done that yet in your environment, go ahead and start considering how to do that. Again, in that resource guide that you'll all have access to, it will tell you how to set that up, how to start auditing to look for any LDAP communication that doesn't work, and how to set it up to where it reduces any possible effect in your environment. Set it up on the clients first, then enforce it on the server level. Then when that patch comes in January, you don't have to worry about it. You can tell your boss, hey, I got it, we're good. Digitally signed communication overall. So this is another setting that's separate from the LDAP. This is going to affect your SMB and your CIFS communication. This helps maintain the integrity of those communications across your environment. You want to digitally sign it so that way the systems know who they're talking to. And never send unencrypted passwords to SMB servers. If you have the best security policy in the world, you have the best passwords in the world, but you're still using an old school Samba server to hold your home and directory drives, all I have to do is sniff your traffic. Doesn't matter if that person has an 18-character password. In 2 seconds, I can get that password by just looking at your executive sitting there and going to communicate with his home drive. So if you still have any types of servers, new versions of Samba absolutely support digital encryption. They absolutely support signing, so that should not be a problem if your systems are up to date, but always, check, verify it. If it's good, disable it so that you're no longer sending an unencrypted password across your network. Next one is require NTLM version 2 at least. Again, this is one of the authentication methodologies. A lot of people don't consider this. By default, LM, NTLM v1, and NTLM v2 are operating in your environment. And while most of our newer systems are using not even any of those, they're actually using Kerberos, as an attacker, I can tell your domain controller to let me communicate in LM. LM is, I believe, if I remember correctly, less than 56 bits of encryption. There's no way of protecting against that. I can also pull your LM hash from your Active Directory environment and put a rainbow table against it and get everyone's passwords. So anything NTLM or LM related, let's start shutting it down. And Microsoft does give you features that you can audit this communication, know what is using what version, so you can start remediating in your environment until you can eventually get down to NTLM v2, which will definitely help you when you're dealing with third-party solutions that may communicate with Active Directory that may not be compatible with Kerberos. But then you don't have to worry about someone coming in and going, oh, I'll just use an old school thing from 95 to be able to hack you. Last thing on this one is require SSL and 128-bit encryption for NTLM, SSP. This is going to be some of your radius communication and other type of third-party authentication requests that would come into your environment. Again, we're just trying to bring things up to a little bit more of a modern level. Let's see. And now we're getting to our passwords, right? Everyone hates those. So you're going to need 50-character passwords now. You're going to need them to dance, turn around, do a tumble. No, just kidding, just kidding. How many of you have changed your DSRM password? How many of you even know what that is? That's fair, absolutely fair. Your DSRM password is your directory services recovery password. This is when Active Directory goes bunk and you are in the recovery console, you need that password to recover everything or you are screwed. So, that password should be changed daily. I've been not daily, sorry. Annually. If you change it daily, by all means, good luck. But try and change it annually, at least. I've been in environments where it hasn't changed since NT. They set it up, they forgot the password. That's even worse. It's like, oh, so if your Active Directory environment went down right now, what are we going to do? You can't recover it. You have to start new. In that case, it might be easier by that time. So you want to change that password. And again, the default domain administrator password. Let's stop using it, guys. Change it. Store it somewhere non-digitally. Do not put it in a password vault. These are your two most critical passwords. Put them somewhere offline that someone has access to, probably a fire safe, so if something happens, you don't lose the password. Yeah, not... Oh, I'm going to have a heart attack from that. No. Please don't. Excuse me. Oh. Other thing you can do is implement a cool tool called LAPS. LAPS is the Local Administrator Password Solution. This will set the local administrator account for every one of your systems to something random on a regular basis and store it in Active Directory. So if you absolutely need a local admin password to a system, you can use that to pull it from AD, no one else has access to it except for who you define, and then you don't have to worry about using the same password on every single computer that you've ever deployed, or turning around and letting everyone else know that password because it's in your GPO and someone can just pull the GPO and de-encrypt it. Which also means don't have your passwords in your GPOs, please. Exactly. Let's not do that, though. I've seen that, though, and that's really bad. I can't remember. I think I was talking to folks from Microsoft, and they actually went, I can't say what client, but they were at a very interesting municipality that put their passwords in the comment field. And I could not believe that. And it was for the mayor and for other people. Like, All right, disable the storage of LM hashes. You can do this via GPO. Again, once I have some type of domain administrator rights in your network, it can take me less than 30 seconds. I have scared many CISOs, including my own, by showing them how quickly I can get everyone's history of the last 20 passwords they had, and LM hash, which is the easiest to break with a rainbow table, of it in the old school Kerberos and old school NTLM. So it's not very hard for me to get your hashes once I have a domain administrator account and then act whoever I want to. So you want to disable that process in GPO. That will at least get rid of the ones that are so simple to find that maybe a 5-year-old could figure it out with a decoder ring. Changing, again, this is a password probably nobody's ever heard of or actually used. Your Kerberos ticket granting ticket account password. That password is being used to symmetrically encrypt all your tickets that your Active Directory environment issues. You want to change that password at least annually. But if you fire someone who is in your domain administrators group, change that password. But you want to follow the process mentioned. So you want to change it once, wait a day, maybe wait a week if you want, then change it again. This has to do with the password history of that password. So you want to be sure that you clear it completely. So, anyone who likes Spaceballs, yeah, we definitely don't want that. All right, so it's kind of about layers here. We're documenting structure, process, it all matters. You want to rethink how you structure and design your AD environment. You want to retire your legacy functionality to strengthen your overall configuration. You want to isolate and control your network flow to sensitive systems. You want to tier your administration. And you want to modernize your authentication. You also want to sign your LDAP. Seriously, sign it. Let's not get in trouble with that. All right, so trying to move right along here. Let's go to managing, monitoring, and auditing Active Directory. Going to move through this a little bit quick, running short on time. All right, so managing beyond your domain controller. Ideally, you do not want to log into your domain controllers to actually administer it. What you want to use is remote server administration tools, which is freely available from Microsoft, downloaded on your systems, allows you to actually have all the tools that you would in the administrative control panel on your fingertips on whatever system you're using to administer. You could also learn and use PowerShell. That's an option. If you have RSAT, you can import the module on your local system. If you don't have RSAT installed, but you still want to administer that computer, then you would create a PS session to that server, and then you can run your typical Active Directory commands and then hit exit when you're done. As shown here, and again, I'll make sure it's in the resource guide for you. You want to set up your credentials in that methodology. There is a way you can put your username and password in, but again, you're now putting your username and password in clear text, and now it's in the log. You don't want to do that. You want to be able to have AD query or PowerShell query you for those credentials so it encrypts it before it actually puts it in, and then that way it doesn't actually end up in your log. The other thing we want to do is set up auditing, right? So the basic guidance I'm going to give you in that resource guide, because we didn't want to go through it, there's like 13 different categories, but it's all detailed in there for you. It does not replace anything you might have to do for compliance, but it does complement. There are some places that once they've put in some of the auditing settings that I'm giving you all the guidance of, they actually are known to be considered exceeding. The reason for that is one of the things I tell people a lot is they need to audit failure items. If you have the space and ability, audit them. And the reason for this is you can actually find out who's going on in your environment as soon as it happens, as opposed to only knowing after they've gained access. Because while it's great to know that someone breached it, Maybe not good for your job sometimes, but definitely good to know that they did. You also want to know when it started, because then you may actually be able to find out what all made it begin. So you want to use your group policy to define audit settings. You want to use audit categories for more granular control. So this has been available since Windows 7 and Vista, I believe. You want to use audit categories so that way you're not recording everything that happens on a system. It is very painful if you do. You also want to determine the acceptable amount of logging data that works for your environment. Once you do that, you will be like this, and you will be able to know everything about your users. Not so much the NSA. All right, so the last thing here is we're going to talk about identifying suspicious activity. All right, so let's see. So now we know how to level up our DCs. We know how to set up auditing. And the resource guide is going to give you all the details on how to set up everything specific, the event IDs and all that, which is really awesome. The next thing we're super excited for is system logs. Okay, that was more than I expected. I mean, how excited can you get about those, right? You got to learn to love them, okay? Here's the reason. They are your greatest source of information in your environment. And they're your greatest things that people have ignored at times because they say, oh, there's a lot of red, or yellow exclamation points and red X's. I don't know what those exactly mean. They look scary. I don't want to touch it. Again, if you can forge your logs, do so. Maintains integrity. But again, not everyone has that luxury. Completely understandable. You can do with what you can. Security log is going to give you your greatest resource. That's where all your audit data is going to go into. Your system log is going to tell you when system state has changed, when drivers have changed, when services have changed, when the time has changed on your system. So again, if I get in there and start messing around and start messing with your time, that's going to tell you it as long as I don't re-clear your logs on you. Then you have your application and services logs, and there's a couple of those in there that are kind of pretty useful. Your directory service log will tell you when your AD's been replicated, where it got replicated to, and how it got replicated. So if you see someone's workstation replicating and synchronizing your Active Directory database, you know something's wrong. You know that I might have gotten access to your network and I'm trying to find your passwords, because that is a good way for me to get all your hashes without you knowing it, because it'll only record 2 entries. So instead of actually trying to query you for your password, if I got someone else's, I could just keep working on it. Your Windows PowerShell log will give you some basic communication, and this is the one right under application and services logs. It's going to give you some connectivity data. The AppLocker log under Microsoft Windows is going to start telling you what applications are going. So if you use AppLocker, it's a really good feature to use, especially on domain controllers, because if all you're doing is using the default Microsoft stuff, you can lock everything else out and make it a whitelist environment. That way, nothing else, if they even gain access, is going to be able to run. The Microsoft Windows PowerShell log is going to actually be the one that gives you the detail what ran on your system, what commands were run, and sometimes even what the output was. And then the Windows Firewall with advanced features, that will give you all your connectivity data. So the GUI search, here's some quick tips on that. If you're looking in the security log and you need to know what happened, you can use, under the keywords, audit failure or audit success will be your greatest resource of finding if you're looking for failure events or success events. If you use any of the event level things or anything, you're going to get a blank result. So you want to use those 2 keywords depending on what you're searching for. If you're looking for a particular user, unfortunately through this search, it generally has to be an absolute user that resolves. So if you type in some random user ID, it's going to say it doesn't exist in your environment. It's kind of an annoying feature. I wish they would have made this a more abstract search for us. So let's say you're looking for a particular user. Maybe you don't know exactly their name. Maybe it's an admin account that got compromised. You want to use that. You want to go to failure audits or success audits, hit OK, then use the find feature instead and actually search for that account or search for something more verbose, and that will actually give you more results than the other feature would. But at least you've now filtered to only your failure events or success events, so that way you're not searching through as much data. You can create custom views for frequent searches. That is toward the top of your event log, and use the administrative events custom view whenever you're bored, because I know that's everyone's favorite pastime is reading system logs. That would actually give you a lot of warnings because it culminates a lot of the log data, so that way you don't have to look at any one single particular log, and it will let you know if there's any type of failures or warnings within those logs. On On the bottom, that is a common one that I've used more recently for checking for security group changes and exporting it to a CSV. Again, I've put this in the resource guide for you so you know how to use it, especially that command. Looking for sessions, that is the other thing that I want to mention. A lot of users do not like logging off their computer because it takes too long to log in, which I don't get because I'd love to go walk to my computer, log in, walk away, and go get some coffee, right? Like, how would you hate letting your computer log in? Oh, I'm sorry, boss. I got some time for this system to work. QUser command is not exactly PowerShell. It's actually a command prompt. But running it in PowerShell, I've actually created a very cool script that you all can download from the resource guide that will allow you to query all your workstations, all your servers, or every Windows system in your environment, whatever you want. And it will give you the result of every user who's currently logged in, how much idle time they may have had if they do, and when the last time they logged into the environment was. So, if you have users who don't like to log in and log off, and they're keeping their session open, which allows someone to get their credentials when they're not looking, or allows, let's say they have a web browser open, they're on some news site that uses a very sketchy ad network, which is about all of them, and that browser's been sitting for 6 hours. Well, that news organization loves to refresh those ads because they want that ad revenue. But every time that refresh happens, the value of that ad goes down. So it becomes junkier and junkier advertisements. I have watched users be gone for about 12 hours, come back and have a virus because something drove by in that time. So you don't want them to have their sessions open if they don't need to. And with all the side channel exploits, there's just another one released called Netcat a few weeks ago for Intel network management adapters, I believe. We really can't risk the chance of having a stale session sit in our environment. A cool tool to help you manage that is called Lithnet Idle Logoff. It's a free tool on GitHub. I did put that in the resource guide for you as well, also with a way to verify its deployment. I gave you a script for that as well. So, thank you. I want to make sure, like, when I leave a session, sometimes I feel like I don't have enough resources. Like, I learn a lot of stuff comes at me, but I don't really know how to always do it. So, this is one of my first bigger sessions I've always done, so thank you all for coming, for sure. I want to make sure that you all had the information you needed, so it's a 50-page resource guide. I wrote out about 8 different scripts for you to use in PowerShell. I gave you the tools for how to actually set it up as scheduled task. Some of these I'm about to tell you, I've written out as scripts for you. New accounts. You want to know when they started? Gave you a script for that. You can run it. It'll output it to a CSV with the date stamp. So you can just pull up that CSV. Oh, what new account showed up on my network today? What about modified accounts? Same thing. There's a script for that. But these are things you want to do as frequently as you can. If you can do them daily, that would be awesome. If you can do them weekly, that's fine. Knowing what is going on in your environment is pertinent to being able to catch something that's going on. You're not always going to catch someone before they actually get in. You're not always going to catch them before they do something. But this will help you put the pieces together to know how they did it so you can stop it from happening in the future. Changes to privilege counts and groups. Got a script for that too. Password changes. I didn't create the script to do outside typical times. Every company's different. You can definitely run it for how you wish. Otherwise, it's just going to tell you, here's all the people who changed their passwords and the time they changed it. You can just look through that CSV and go, that person shouldn't be working at 11 o'clock at night. Something's wrong.
With that one, what you're talking about, the one where they haven't logged out?
Yeah.
Write me a script that if they haven't logged out, it forces them to change their password next login. I did that for one.
Well,
I did that for one employee 5 nights in a row. She finally started logging out.
I like that. Well, so the tool I mentioned, that Lithnet one, will force a log off after so much idle time. And that has enforced them very well. So the password thing, I feel like I'd have pitchforks at me, but something to consider. But so far, the tool logging them off automatically has been more than enough to get people to stop because they get angry and say, well, now I want an off-domain system. Good luck. Not happening. Group policy modifications. I didn't create a script for that yet. I'm sorry. But that's something you can check for, and I'll probably end up writing a script on there pretty shortly on pshell.dev. That's my PowerShell site that I run. So, altogether, we want to stay vigilant across our environment, right? We want to get cozy with our system logs. And no, that is not a joke for the fact that I work for a company called Kino Cozy. But get cozy with them. Start understanding them. Start giving them the TLC that they deserve. They will be your greatest asset when something goes wrong. You want to use PowerShell to search for specific events when suspect. Your event logs are going to tell you, hey, something went wrong, but PowerShell can tell you a lot more about it without digging through too much weeds. Develop a daily routine, weekly, monthly, whatever works for you. Try to do it weekly at least. Check for any irregularities within your environment. Look for unexpected sessions on systems. Again, if you can build out a policy within your environment that says, hey, every user has to be logged off every night. You know, most of the companies I work with right now, after someone's been idle for more than 5 hours, it logs them off. And that's worked for most of them. This is all about risk acceptance, right? What is more tolerable to your business? What is more tolerable for your work? Are you okay with things happening on a daily basis and only checking them once a week? You know, whatever works for you. You want to review and audit your configuration annually at least. It can be a pain in the butt, but it is beneficial, and then you have a lot less to work on down the road. So, really proud of you for all sticking in on this. It's definitely a lot of content, a lot of information, very overwhelming. As I said, you got a resource guide coming to you that will detail all out how to set up this stuff. If you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to me. There's some scripts I left out there for you. On both my two websites I'll mention here in a minute. There's going to be continuing posts on things like this, so I'm going to try and continue the conversation. So by all means, if there's something that you're stumped on, something you don't understand, maybe a setting, or maybe you want me to come back and speak about something else more complicated, let me know, okay? And really pat yourselves on the back. I mean, you're taking steps to improve your environment. This is not an easy job. There's a lot of data out there. I'm not expecting everyone to be experts. It has taken me 20 years to get to the point where I'm at now. Don't be afraid of it. Constantly learn. That's what IT is all about, right? So, syntaxbearer.io/spiceworld2019 is where the resource guide and links are at. The password is SpiceRex. I also have little cards here that I can give you that also have this information. You can hit me up on Twitter at Chris Cly or chris.cly@ieee.org. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. And that is it, except for if anyone has any questions. Thank you.